Okay, so today I want to share something a little special with you. This is an abbreviated version of a workshop that I gave. I've done this at multiple conferences, and it's usually very popular. I remember one time when I gave this session, it was placed at the end of the last day of this conference, which is known as kind of the kiss of death, Sunday at, 4 p.m. And I said, okay, nobody's going to show up for this. And then I walked into the room and it was a packed house. There wasn't an empty seat. People seem to be very fascinated in this topic. So today we're going to talk about Hoodoo therapy, what I call Hoodoo therapy. And it's what I've learned about therapy from studying low country root doctors. Now, I'll explain what root doctors are and what hoodoo therapy is as we go along. But before we even get started, I just want to let anyone watching or listening know how much I really have appreciated the interactions I've had with people who practice low country conjure, hoodoo, those kind of aspects, because I've actually learned quite a bit from them. So you can find a lot of the information more in depth in my book, Low Country Shamanism, an exploration of the magical and healing practices of the coastal Carolinas and Georgia. I moved to South Carolina, probably about 13, 14 years ago, and I kind of immersed myself in the culture, and I really became fascinated, as I'll discuss in just a little bit, on this idea of this hidden magical and healing system that was fairly prevalent, but not a lot of people talked about it. And I really went out of my way to kind of talk to as many first-person practitioners as I could, and I picked a few to really focus on in my book. And I've really learned a lot about therapeutic interaction and creating kind of these creative, transformative moments from my interactions with them. So let me just start with this idea of what is the Low Country. Well, this is kind of the image we have of the Low Country with the moss and the live oak trees and the magnolias and the moonlight. There is some truth to all of this imagery, but the Low Country, specifically the area that I'm talking about in the southeastern United States, is this area of coastal area of North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, maybe a tiny bit at the tip of North Florida. And this whole area is historically been kind of the entrance that unfortunately, a lot of slaves brought from Africa entered into. And you find a large slave population in the Low Country historically. Now, these people who were slaves after Reconstruction, a lot of their communities became very isolated out in the Sea Islands, and they kind of had their own culture at that point, because many of obviously the white plantations and things like that after the Civil War were kind of discontinued or even abandoned. And so a lot of these people were kind of left to their own devices to live their own lives out on the Sea Islands and these hidden parts of the Low Country coastal areas. And so they created a kind of a synthesis of our Western culture, along with tying in a lot of Afro-centric ideas about the world, spirituality. Now, this we call the Gullah, sometimes called the Geechee. Now, these very amazingly resilient people, as I mentioned, were brought over on slave ships from West Central Africa. Now, what you'll see is that the two primary slave ports on this southeastern area were Charleston, South Carolina, and Savannah, Georgia. So this is a whole area where there was a large contingency of African Americans, or at that time African slaves, and they were brought over to work in the rice fields and indigo. Indigo and rice were the primary crop that you'll find in the Low Country. It was very profitable. Now, just real quickly, Sometimes I get asked about why do you call it Gullah Geechee, where they're interchangeable terms, although you'll find the Geechee more in the coastal areas of Georgia, a little bit of northern Florida. So if you really want to know about the cultural heritage corridor of Gullah Geechee, these people kind of mark from Jacksonville, Florida, up north to practically Jacksonville, North Carolina. It's just a large area where you find a lot of hidden culture and really vibrant and alive ways of seeing the world. Just like I said, are remarkably resilient people. They have their own language, their own way of seeing interaction, as we'll talk about as we go along. So let's just kind of start with what is hoodoo, what is a root doctor, and we'll get into how in the world did I get into all of this kind of stuff. So let's start with this idea of looking at how do I put this, kind of root doctors from this perspective of a traditional healer. So we're looking at them as these conjurers, these healers, these descendants of African slaves would turn to. Even while there were slaves, there were root doctors inside the slave communities to help. Now, we call them a root doctor is because they used herbs, roots, potions, all kind of magical spells to help and sometimes to hurt. Root doctors, a lot of times we'll also interchangeably call them hoodoo doctors, hoodoo man, hoodoo woman, because it could be both male or female. During this slave time period and after, a lot of times there were some economic issues that kept African Americans from being able to obtain medical care. If you were the slave owner and you bought a slave, it was quite a bit of money. And unless the slave had some kind of injury or illness that might result in their death, a lot of times some of these owners were not willing to pay to have a medical doctor come in and treat them. So a lot of times these resilient people found ways to help heal themselves. Now, what's interesting, as we'll see in a minute, the West Central Africa landscape is very similar to the low country of the southeastern United States. So there may have been some kind of similarities in plants and different herbs that they use to help heal people. Root doctors are still actually very common in a lot of these areas, but they are not quite as open. I found that most, not all, but most of the true root doctors or hoodoo doctors kind of keep a low profile. It's almost like word of mouth, and people will seek them out, but they don't advertise a whole lot. As a matter of fact, one root doctor even told me, if you see them putting out billboards and all these signs and making a fuss, you might want to stay away from them because they don't have real magic. They don't have real hoodoo or mojo working for them. But again, that may be not in every case. But these root doctors were also kind of the mediators for disputes within the slave community and even in the after Reconstruction in the African American communities. They were predominantly there to help, but yes, sometimes you had root doctors who claimed to be able to put curses, which sometimes we call root. You're putting the root on somebody, to kind of sabotage people. And unfortunately, this really amazing system of healing and magic gets kind of a bad rap. Because it's seen as black magic, and I'm not saying black as in the race of the individual who's practicing it, but as a negative way of working occult practices. And I have found the bulk of the people I talked to, this was not the case. They were predominantly interested in helping people and creating more success and happiness for their fellow human being. So it's a kind of a little bit of a I guess bias that a lot of people have. So I mentioned West Central Africa. So in these parts of Africa, kind of meeting in the middle is where a good chunk of slaves came into the southeastern United States. And that you find a lot of them have their origin in the spiritual beliefs of this region. Things like they call ancestor worship. They're not worshiping ancestors, but it's a kind of a ritual reverence for ancestors, hoping that the ancestors would provide them with the ability to perform certain magic to help people. You also find that the root doctors kind of filled this traditional role of the priest and the healer in as I mentioned, enslaved communities. I mean, every culture has their priest healer archetype, and this culture has that nonetheless. Now, I just wanted to kind of give you an idea of the conditions a lot of times that slaves had to live in. Pictured, you see I think it's from Magnolia Plantation near Charleston, some of the slave quarters. And essentially this were just brick buildings with maybe a little fireplace or not. And these people, pretty cold in the winters and incredibly hot in the summers. If you've ever been to the southeastern U.S., it's very hot, but it's so humid that it can be quite dangerous. And these people had to toil out in this sometimes 106-degree temperatures with 100% humidity for 12 hours or more a day, with sometimes minimal care and nutrition and things like that. So they needed ways to be able to feel like they had some control over their environment, over their lives, when they unfortunately had no control. And Hoodoo kind of provided that kind of psychological mechanism to feel like they had a little more control. So we need to start with what is Hoodoo, and I'm kind of supplying a lot of this as my definition of Hoodoo, but I think it's fairly consistent with many others I've seen. I kind of define this as a form of shamanistic folk magic and healing. Now, I call this low country shamanism because when reading a lot about reports of shamanism, even the initial criteria that Eliade wrote back in the 40s, which, there's some dispute on that now. But having said that, a lot of the aspects that root doctors perform and do are pretty consistent with what we would call shamans, the ability to go from this world to another world to retrieve spiritual information. As I mentioned, healing with herbs and roots, and sometimes they think the herbs and the roots had magical properties. Mediumistic tendencies, all these kind of ritualistic activities really does fit the criteria of shamanism. And it's kind of funny to me is that I see so many people who have to go to South America or the Tibet or wherever in search of trying to find shamanism. And we have a wonderful history of shamanism here, certainly in the United States with our own Native American population. But I will contend with the Gullah Geechee, you find a lot of shamanistic practices. It's very difficult to get information out of many of them about it, but it is there. So sometimes the most extraordinary things are located in your own backyard. So these teachings and rituals of Hoodoo are passed down from one practitioner to another. Now, sometimes this ran in families to where, one member of the family had the gift and the next generation it was passed on. And sometimes just people out of the blue start having strange experiences, and then an older person in the community who's recognized as a healer, as a Hoodoo practitioner, will mentor them and kind of teach them the ways so that they can learn to utilize their gifts towards helping and healing and working in that realm. So a lot of the rituals that these individuals do really vary depending on the individual performing them. Now, it's one thing I found that I really tie into good psychotherapy is there's no strict approach that one must adhere to. Now, I just feel that anyone who's listened to any of my podcasts, my lectures, seminars, workshops, I'm always talking about we got to make sure that our approach is not so rigid and standardized that we forget there's a human being in front of us that might be a little different than we expect them to be. Well, the really nice thing about the Hoodoo practitioners is they certainly have different rituals that fit similar patterns, but what's really fascinating is that they really have so much flexibility to kind of mold that to the person who's requesting the ritual. So one person may do a ritual a certain way, and then another person may do the same ritual, but in a slightly different way based on the needs, desires, and personality of the individual seeking the help. And it's one thing I want to point out is Hoodoo is mainly practiced here in the southern United States, although it has it all over the United States, but you find a big congregation here. Although one of my colleagues told me that they're finding a huge amount hotbeds in Baltimore, Maryland right now. So it's really spread. But I want to point out most people who practice Hoodoo generally, not all the time, but generally and traditionally were Protestant Christians. Now, if you go back to the 1940s, there's a book that was written by the WPA, which was a government program that Franklin Roosevelt put in to help artists and writers and people like that to find work. And it was kind of an anthropological, ethnographic view of slave life, of former slaves' lives. And they would talk a lot of times about their spiritual beliefs and root doctors and people like that. And what they found in the book was called, I think, Drums and Shadows. What they found is that most of the root doctors were Christian, and many root doctors were actually ministers in the African American sanctified churches. And what you'll find in a lot of churches of that caliber, even today, are there certain little rituals, little practices that may seem a little strange, but they're tied in to African spirituality. For example, a lot of times you'll see blue windows on some small African American churches. Well, blue is a color for water, and there's a belief that spirits can't travel across water, so it would help keep the bad spirits out. So you also see things like blue bottles in people's hanging from a tree or in people's yards now. Now it's a cool new Southern fashion, but its root is in root work, in that there's a belief that if you put these bottles out, certain spirits, when they tried to encroach upon your property, would get trapped in the bottle. The color of blue was used primarily and couldn't get out to help kind of protect or ward off spirits. So a lot of times, like I say, when people read about traditional hoodoo and things like that, they come away, unfortunately, with the idea that this is almost this dark, satanic practice. But in most cases, that has not really true. Now, there are some really dark characters out there who've done that, but they are in the minority. The majority were usually there to help other people, or at least that's what I found. So again, Hoodoo tradition emphasizes each individual's personal magical powers invoked by the use of certain tools, spells, all kinds of methods and techniques. Even though they're set a specific way, there is some flexibility to them. And it describes these magical properties to herbs, roots, minerals, animal parts, personal possessions. One thing is Hoodoo practitioners do not like their hair being left around, like say after a haircut, because they're always worried that somebody could take that hair and use it as a magical property to maybe put a root on them or curse on them, or kind of pull away their life energy through the use of their personal possessions and properties. So basically, I'm referring to root work is a distinct form of hoodoo practice in the low country areas of the coastal southeastern U.S. Now, you'll find people outside the area who claim to be root workers, and they probably are, but this is really where it got its start, and it has kind of spread. Now, at this point, I'm usually asked about the difference between hoodoo and voodoo. Basically, voodoo, spelled with a V, as in Victor, is really coming out of Louisiana. Now, what happened is you had the French who were overseeing Haiti in the days. They had a slave uprising, and basically the French got run out of Haiti. And when they brought their slaves with them to Louisiana, they kind of filled in kind of the gaps of African religion with Catholicism, because most of the French were primarily Catholic. So voodoo was a hidden religion in which the slaves kind of transposed some of their African saints and I'm sorry, not saints, deities onto saints, Catholic saints. And so you got a synthesis of Catholicism and African spirituality. That's why in voodoo you find characters like Papa Legban and those who actually correspond in some qualities to some African saints. And it provided the slaves to be able to worship kind of in secret, so they may be praying to somebody other than one of the saints. But voodoo is primarily seen as, yes, it's a magical system for healing, but it's also seen as a religion, whereas root work is primarily mostly just this magical and healing system practiced by Protestants, Christians. Since Protestants don't have saints or anything like that, some elements of that kind of disappeared. So I'm going to go through these 5 applications of root work, and this is based on the work of Michael Bell, who is a anthropologist, and he kind of categorized these into these different categories. The first is punitive acts, and these are the spells that cause misfortune and anguish to a person or a group of people, and this is, you're punishing someone. So if you've crossed the root doctor can put a spell on to cause you misfortune. For example, if you cheat a root doctor out of something, a couple months later you notice that your wife ran off with another man, or somebody came and stole your money, and you might attribute that to having revenge enacted onto you, that the root doctor put the root on you, and it caused this punitive act. Next is a diagnostic act, and this is work where they're trying to determine what the cause of a person's particular ailment is, and who, I should put, or what is responsible. Sometimes root doctors figured out it was physical ailments, and then you need to take this root, this herb, or change this dietary thing. But a lot of times they also felt that if you were experiencing a lot of misfortune or illness, it may be due to spirits, evil spirits bothering you. It may be due to someone who has put the root on you. So you may have a curse on you, someone who is jealous of you and has put some kind of bad energy upon you. And then they diagnose that really is what the problem is. There's no problem with you. It's a problem of this root that's been put on you. So curative acts, and this is where we get to the healing part. This is where your removal of any negative situation or action which has been placed on you by either the evil spirits, other individuals, or not even another root doctor. There's a lot of stories about root doctor battles as who had the biggest amount of energy and power. So if you were having some, let's say, mental health issues, you'd go to the root doctor, who would maybe do the diagnostic act and then give a curative act to help you overcome whatever was troubling you. Then there's the protection acts, much as like we talked about the blue bottles. These actions are designed to kind of offer protection from any potential harm in the future that's caused by either other hoodoo acts or evil spirits. Now here's where we get into this idea of different amulets, and different, they talk about mojo bags, which we'll talk about in a second, something to protect you from future harm. At the same time, also, you can tie that into good fortune acts, which is our next category. And these are the actions and rituals designed to create luck in areas such as love, money, family, those kind of things. Well, those protection acts can also give you roots and amulets and magical items, which are there for you to carry with you to increase your luck. Now, this has its root in a lot of the African magical practices in that area that these slaves originally came from. And you talked about the hoodoo doctor as the priest healer. The old talk about the witch doctor is an archetype that is rooted in, a witch meaning, doing the magical, but a doctor meaning doing the healing. And so a lot of these practices here that we're finding, these applications, are tied to the kind of historical use of magic and healing in African communities before they were kind of ripped out of their homeland and forced to come to the United States. Okay, so I guess I should get to how did I get into this stuff. Well, it's interesting. It's a long story about a rooted client, ghost tours, and a license plate. So I'll try to make this long story very short. When I first moved to South Carolina, I moved here. I took a job teaching at a local college, and I had a private practice. I still do work out of. And I was in a supervision group one day. So we had new therapists who'd come in, and we would try to, give them information and help when they get stuck on cases and those kind of things. And so one therapist came in, and she had a client who she didn't know what to do with, because this client was having such huge amounts of anxiety, almost just out and out panic attacks, because he was African American, believed that somebody had placed a root on him. And again, a root in that context is like a curse. And he didn't know what was going to happen to him. And so his anxiety was going through the roof. And so she had been trying to do all the things that you probably will get you nowhere, like talk logic and reason, and use all that good cognitive behavioral techniques to try and make him see the light of rational thinking, but it was going nowhere. So at hearing this long story about this client and how stuck she was, I just came to the conclusion, as I told her, I said, well, I'm always big into utilizing what's presented to me. So if your client truly believes that he has been rooted, the only way to change that is to get unrooted. So you might try to brainstorm ways to find people who will take off the curse. Now, whether I believe in that or not is really not important. It's what's happening with my client. But that kind of gave me this strange thought about, I've never heard about rooting a client and somebody putting the root on me. I'd heard of voodoo, but never hoodoo. So I started kind of reading on different things and trying to understand what was this hidden culture that wasn't out there really presenting itself. It obviously had enough power to inflict this kind of terror on a human being to where he was basically being diagnosed with panic disorder due to something that we couldn't see, touch, or hear. So a couple weeks later after that, I went to Savannah, Georgia, which actually my undergrad, I went to college there. Loved the town, and it's a very interesting mystical town in its own right. And I was taking one of these ghost tours, and I take those every now and then because I actually find that I get more history on the ghost tours than I really do on the history tours, and they're fun. So my wife at the time and I were taking that, and I noticed that the tour guide was just every now and then would talk about boo hags and putting roots and root workers and hoodoo. And so, I talked to him a little bit after the tour, and he kind of gave me some very evasive answers to my questions about this stuff. So on the way home the next day, we're driving down Highway 17, which is a fairly well-traveled road in the Low Country, and I'm sitting there, and I'm thinking about this. I can't get out of my mind. It's like, is there really this hidden tradition of healing and magic and all this out there that not a lot of people are really investigating? And then I voiced that to my former wife, and right as I said that, this car, this white BMW, kind of drives by, and it slows down. It's passing us, and it's kind of sitting there, and I look over, and the license plate says magic, but it's spelled M-A-G-I-C-K, and the K is the occult spelling. And my wife said, I think you got your answer there. And, I don't know if I got my answer or not, but it's like, that is just too strange. And then the next week, I was talking to a very conservative colleague of mine at the college who I really respect, but he's kind of an old Southern guy and kind of seemed set in his ways about a lot of things. Nice fella. And I mentioned to him about, about the root, and I was learning about all this stuff. And I said something like, it might be just a whole bunch of silliness. And at that moment, he sat up in his chair and he pointed his finger right at me. And he said, Paul, you be careful with that. That stuff's real. And it ain't nothing to play around with. Which this just shocked me. This is probably one of the smartest people I'd ever met as far as educated and refined, and yet he's a little bothered that I was too light in my demeanor about it. So all of that came together to create this synchronicity that really pushed me to start exploring this topic. So with any topic, anyone who knows me, I become just immersed in it. When I got a new thing, a new book or something that I'm doing, I just become a little obsessive compulsive, I'll admit it. And I start reading everything, going to any training, just immersing myself in it. That's kind of what happened. So before I get into my journey, I just want to pay homage to some important figures in the Low Country who are tied to this practice of hoodoo. This is a painting of Denmark Vesey, who, along with the root doctor Gullah Jack, tried to lead a pretty large slave rebellion in 1822. They were trying to rise up and fight their way out to ships in the harbor and essentially escape and go back home, so to speak. Unfortunately, it did not succeed. Although today there is a little monument to Denmark Vesey that is in downtown Charleston. If you're ever there, you can seek it out. But he found that the root doctor Gullah Jack actually helped him get a lot of the slaves who followed him into certain ecstatic states that they almost felt that they were bulletproof. I kind of tie it into the Boxer Rebellion in China, where a lot of these people were so in such these intense states that they were told that bullets wouldn't even harm them, which of course turned out not to be true. But Gullah would get a lot of these people so worked up, and he would provide them with certain practices and amulets and things like that to protect them, that they really felt that they would be successful. Now, what's really interesting is that, and this is for a different lecture by a historian, this rebellion really started changing some things slowly over the next 40 years about the slave and white population in a lot of areas of the United States. So now this is I don't know how to say it. It's a painting of a picture. Now, I don't know for sure if this is really Dr. Buzzard, but we're just going to pretend it is, because if it's not him, this is probably similar to how he looked. And I want to be clear, anyone who is a Gullah or hoodoo practitioner, any of these pictures I'm showing of actual hoodoo practitioners, it is done with the utmost respect. A lot of times these folks have been ridiculed for their beliefs, and if I'm showing a picture, it is there to kind of help people understand and see the humanity of this. A lot of root doctors, by the way, don't like having their picture made, because the picture could be used in part of a magical ceremony to be used against them, like their hair and those kind of things. Now, the reason I put the famous, infamous Dr. Buzzard is there's really two Dr. Buzzards. There's the Dr. Buzzard that the white people heard about, and there's the Dr. Buzzard that the black people heard about. He was, his original name, or his birth name rather, was Stephanie Robinson, and he died, I believe, in 1947. Dr. Buzzard was the most famous hoodoo doctor in North America. Now, you had other figures in voodoo, like Marie Laveau. Well, this would be kind of a similar person. Dr. Buzzard had people literally from all over North America they'd write to him, they'd come to see him. He made a crazy amount of money for that time because his magic was so powerful, and people thought that he could really help them. Now, what's fascinating is that you have to look at the context here. So we're talking about the 20s and 30s. Now, at this point, a lot of African Americans were kind of being, were being persecuted and treated unfairly. So a lot of times, Dr. Buzzard would go in and advocate in the magical realm from African Americans who had been or either in prison or looking at going to jail and all this. So he would show up in the courtroom while they were being tried and what they call chew the root, where he would sit with a root in his mouth, chewing on it, making magical symbols, and quietly putting a spell against the jury or for the client or both. He seemed to be a pretty charismatic and powerful person. Now, he also did a lot of good. I know he has like 2 or 3 churches on St. Helena Island, which is off the coast of Beaufort, South Carolina. He built, and he did help a lot of people. He had an adversary we'll talk about in just a little bit, and it's a bit of legend around here that we'll call the Hoodoo Wars between these two. But to this day, I have talked to African American people, younger people, and I bring up Dr. Buzzard, and some of them still have heard of Dr. Buzzard. Now, other people after his death have taken on the mantle of Dr. Buzzard, but the original Dr. Buzzard was an amazing figure. Funny story about him, anytime people would send him money to perform some spell for them, he'd go to the post office, and he'd open the letter, and if it was not cash, he would just throw it in the trash. So he only wanted the cash. Maybe it's because he didn't want to be persecuted by the tax man. I'm not sure. But he's a remarkable individual. Now, his grandson, who is named Arnold Gregory, is a root doctor on St. Helena Island. I think he's still practicing. I actually tried to contact him through a family friend, and he was willing to talk to me about some things, but overall he did not really want to contribute because he had a concern that if he talked too much about hoodoo, that the spirits may seek some form of retribution against him. So they kind of walked that line, so I wasn't able to interview him for the book. This is a picture of Dr. Jim Jordan, Como, North Carolina, southern North Carolina. And he was a remarkable guy during the 40s and 50s. He helped a lot of people out. And he was so successful at what he did, even the white doctors in the area, if they couldn't help someone, they would send him to Jim Jordan. He was also a philanthropist, even though he was making a good bit of money from his root work. He did a lot of good. He paid off many people's mortgages, bought cars for people who needed them, donated a lot of philanthropic organizations, and to this day, people who kind of remember him or his legend, it's usually a positive, and that's cross-racial and economic boundaries. It turns out he was a very generous, kind, and powerful person. Pardon me. Now, this is a very rare photo, and I'm very honored to have it. This is of William Barnum Sr. of Savannah, Georgia. They called him a lot of times Prophet. Now, he's one who didn't like his photo taken, I'm assuming, too often because we don't have a lot of pictures. This was supplied to me by his daughter, my very good friend, Angel Hakeem. Angel is also a root doctor. She uses the title spiritual analyst. And a little side note, she has a doctorate in counselor education and supervision. So she has a foot in both worlds, the Western psychotherapy world and the world of hoodoo and spirituality. But Prophet was a very charismatic guy. He had abilities, they claimed, of spiritualism and mediumship. And Angel told me their phone in the house rang constantly because people were calling Prophet for one thing or another, for help or for him to come speak. And he said he could be a very imposing figure, but he's another one that did a lot of good things to try and help people, and just kind of an interesting character. I think Angel told me that he had this car that was painted bright yellow and had all these crosses and Star of David and these esoteric symbols. So everyone knew when Prophet drove by who was driving that car. But seemed to be a wonderful person. I wish I could have gotten. This is a rare photo of Valerie Boyles, also known as Minerva. If you ever read the book Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil, maybe seen the movie. I wasn't too big on the movie. It looks beautiful, but I didn't care for it. The book's more interesting. She was the common law wife of famed root doctor Dr. Eagle, which in the book they said she was married to Dr. Buzzard, and that is not true. She rarely had her picture taken for the reasons we talked about, and this I think was from South Magazine. This is like one of the few pictures we have of her, and some people have conjectured it's because they paid her a decent amount of money, and that's the only reason she allowed it. Some people have said that she was slightly schizophrenic and could be very erratic and unstable. Other people paid her handsomely for her services. Jim Williams, who was a very prominent Savannah business person, actually used her during his trial for murder, which Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil kind of talks about. But she's very well known in Savannah. You're talking about Minerva. A lot of people still know exactly who the heck you're talking about. Now, this is the Bone Man, Oscar Gilchrist from Nichols, South Carolina, which is not too far from Myrtle Beach. He's passed away, but he was known as the Bone Man because he would go out and find animal bones, and he would use those in his rituals. And he would totally used all kinds of different ceremonies and things like that to try and help people. He also was really big on actual using roots and herbs, and he didn't know anything about them. He said he just let the spirits take him out in the woods to where he needed to go, and they would say, get this. And so he would pick whatever and provide it to his client, who apparently would feel better and be healed, even though he had no real knowledge of botany and those kind of things. Now, his son has taken over his root work, but his son keeps a very, very low profile. And this is a picture from a book. This is Ed McTeer, who was the sheriff of Beaufort County for like 23 years, and I think he was the youngest sheriff ever elected. And he was also a root doctor, and sometimes he called himself a witch doctor. But Ed McTeer grew up in the Gullah culture, the Hoodoo culture, and he claimed to have ESP, and he immersed himself into their root work techniques and things like that. And he and Dr. Buzzard had this, as I mentioned earlier, this little psychic battle, because McTeer was trying to arrest Dr. Buzzard for one thing or another, and some of it may be legit, some of it may not be so legit, but either way, it turned into this big psychic battle, if you will, and only ended after Dr. Buzzard's son was killed in a car wreck, and Dr. Buzzard attributed that to the root put on him, and went to McTeer's office and pretty much said, "Uncle, and let's call a truce, let's not do this anymore." And they ended up, side note, I think actually sharing information, and I'm not saying being friends, but being very friendly to each other toward the end. But yeah, you had a white sheriff who was a root doctor, only down here in the Low Country. It's an interesting place. Here's a quick picture of a unnamed root doctor from Estill, South Carolina. You'll notice, even though it's an old picture, some of the African figurines, candles, and you see even from the black and white, you see they're different colors, and altar, and he's working his magic there. You also see a more modern picture from a root doctor in Jasper County, who's preparing his root for ritual. You can see the playing cards there. You've heard of tarot cards. Sometimes they use playing cards for divination techniques and things like that. Here's a picture of a Caucasian root doctor who's very respected, named Doc Coyote, New Hanover, North Carolina. He, interestingly enough, he'd always been fascinated in root work and studied all kinds of different magical systems, but came back to, as he says, his own backyard. And he's very immersed in it, very respectful of the African tradition, and all kinds of people, again, all races and socioeconomic ways seek him out. He doesn't advertise much. He details, and I write about this in my book, kind of a quasi-religious experience that he had when he found the gravesite for the late Dr. Jim Jordan, and he felt compelled to kind of carry on Dr. Jordan's work, and he was very helpful with a lot of the research I was doing. But he's another one that keeps a low profile. Now, this was a secret initiation ceremony on St. Helena Island, South Carolina. I felt comfortable showing this. This was given to me by one of my friends I'll talk about in just a minute. Because the faces, you can't really see who's who. So I want to respect everyone's privacy. But you can clearly see this ritual, the candles. Something's going on here that you don't usually see too much in everyday society. So I want to get back to this idea of the protective root. Now, a root's sometimes called a bodyguard in the Low Country. In other parts that we call it as a mojo bag. So that can have different substances, different things that you put and you hold in your pocket. John the Conqueror is one of the biggest ones used for personal power and protection, but all kinds of different roots can correspond to create these bodyguards that people can carry with them for luck and for the ability to be successful in life. Here's a picture of an area called a working area, and this is from a modern root doctor. I love that alligator head. It kind of creeps me out a little bit. But different potions, candles, tarot deck. They would come into their altar and do a lot of the work, creating their spells, their roots, and things like that. Here's a waiting area of a root doctor's home office. I'm going to tell you, this is a little interesting because what looks like a bunch of graffiti and numbers is actually a whole bunch of secret symbols, according to the root doctors, or they call them sigils, I think, in chaos magic. And these things have protective power and all kinds of different ways to ensure that your working space is kept pure and safe from, I guess, evil spirits or even maybe other people who might have not so nice intentions towards you and your work. Here's a quick picture of me and a gentleman who provided me with some of these photos. This is Dr. Buzzard. Now, this is the new Dr. Buzzard. This is actually Andy Tate. Andy and his wonderful wife, Bernice, are artists, performance artists, writers, filmmakers. They do a lot of amazing things. And Andy does a one-man performance about Dr. Buzzard, and he kind of takes the archetype of the Hoodoo doctor and expands upon it. And this was at one of his performance art showings, and he has his mandrake root, and I'm holding a bottle that says, you can't really see, but it says something like hoodoo water on it that he was kind of having out there. But Andy and his wife are dear friends of mine, and I really admire their creativity. And they kind of showed me how there's a tie-in to performance and art. Now, even though Andy's an actor and an artist, he is also a legitimate practitioner of hoodoo. And I consider him an expert on a lot of the African-centered spirituality. So I'm grateful to know him and his wife. So let's kind of jump into this last part here. And what I'm defining as hoodoo therapy may be similar to the way I see psychotherapy. So hoodoo therapy allows people to move back and forth between the familiar and the unfamiliar. So we're moving from the ordinary to the extraordinary. So when you're sitting and working with a root doctor, they're creating these experiences and rituals and things to kind of shake up your perception of reality, which activates our emotional brain, not our thinking and logical brain. It creates this emotional state that activates such other higher level states as curiosity, almost fear, but kind of playful fear, if that makes any sense. And if it doesn't, I apologize. It's the only way I can think of it. But that's what kind of starts the change process a lot of times. It also initiates spontaneous action rather than rational, calculated responses. Now, to me, psychotherapy can learn a lot from that, because if something's happening in the moment, you need to jump on that. That's one thing I was shown by the root doctors. If something out of the ordinary happens, jump on it. If you're in a session with somebody and a bird flies up to the window and just starts singing, just bring it in. Talk about, well, what's this bird trying to tell us? Bring it in rather than just ignore it. So it draws upon these inexplicable mysteries that we all have in life to kind of help us in changing, breaks our spells, limitations, and uses all forms of action that can influence or bring about transformation. Hoodoo doctors are not limited to only one way of doing things. So Hoodoo therapy encourages us to seize upon our own personal magical expressions, and they view any coincidence as confirmation that something special is happening. Real big about signs and omens. And I think that's something we can learn from. So as we get to the end here, I want to just talk about the similarities, and these are just a few. I do more than this in the regular presentation, but I want to share this with you today. Similarities between Hoodoo and psychotherapy. The first, there's a lot of pattern alterations. So they use rituals and the expectancy on the part of the client to alter any kind of dysfunctional patterns. And this is breaking a spell. So from a therapy perspective, we see clients all the time who are under spells. There's spells of limitation, spells of depression, things like that. So just breaking up some of those patterns, altering the patterns, a lot of times can break those spells. I think it was the late Ernie Rossi who said that the creative moment occurs when habitual patterns are interrupted. And Milton Erickson was a master at interrupting patterns, as were the therapists at the Mental Research Institute. So using rituals and the client's expectancy to alter those patterns can create amazing results. One thing I found, the externalization of the problem. You hear about narrative therapy where you name the problem and that's not the problem. It's it's not your depression. It's Mr. Depression or whatever name you give to it. Well, in a similar way, it's not ever really you. It's the root. So it's the root that someone's placed on you. It's the spirits bothering you. It's all coming from this other world. So it's not a way to let you off responsibility. It's like it keeps you from identifying with your problem as much, because the problem isn't you. It's this other thing that's happened to you. So if you have anxiety disorder and you go to the root doctor's saying, well, it's because your nervous system is overactive due to blah blah blah. They're going to say, well, hey, that ain't you. Somebody's doing something to you. If you're scared and have these panic because nothing's going on, then it's somebody's put the root on you, or the spirits are trying to teach you something, or whatever it is, which helps so much with clients, I think, not feeling debilitated, and actually helps with some of that expectancy. So I found that the therapy is interactive. The healer's part of the interaction. Anything that the root doctor, he or she, says or does is part of the process, and what comes back to them from the client, they utilize. Now, this is classic. You read about cybernetics, where first order and second order. And second order is that the therapist is part of the interaction, and so this is this dynamic back and forth that I think Heinz von Forster said, in order to know, you have to act. So everything's about interaction. Sure, they may have some predetermined rituals, but even those are tweaked based on what's happening in the moment. And then therapy is a performance. Now, I think it was Brad Keeney who said something to the extent of that he thought therapy should be moved out of the social sciences and placed into the School of Performing Arts, which I highly agree with. Now, the one thing I've noticed, a root doctor told me one time, is like, we got to be more intense, passionate, and scarier than the root. When people come to us, if we are not charismatic and powerful in our own way, not overpowering, but powerful to where the client has that confidence in what we're doing, if we can't be more intense than what it is they're facing, then we're not going to have that power. So it doesn't mean we always have to be loud and aggressive, but depending on what our clients are giving us, we need to use that as kind of a performance interaction. Some root doctors aren't over the top and really charismatic and intense, but at the same time, maybe that's what their clients need in that moment. So either way, they're doing something that to make themselves an active part of the process, and pulling in these emotional states in the moment. Because if you go to the root doctor and you leave the same as you went, and it just seemed like you're talking to yet another person, then you probably weren't seeing a real root doctor. Something magical has had to happen, even if it's not Harry Potter magical, just in the interaction where you walk away saying, well, something was going on. She really got me, or he really did something or said something that was so out of the ordinary, because we need that to kind of help those patterns. So just for a moment, I want to just mention the cultural implications. You may get our clients who very seriously believe that somebody has hexed them or put the root on them, or, not just here in the southeastern United States, in all cultures. We don't have to always believe that's true. We might need to really respect their belief system, though, and maybe work within the parameters of their belief system, because we're talking about cultures who have helped and healed people for longer than psychotherapy has ever been alive. And I think we need to have some degree of respect. Even if we do things differently, maybe we need to see the root doctor as kind of a distant cousin, part of our family tree of healing and healers. So having respect to not automatically dismiss someone's fears of the supernatural might not only help with treatment outcomes, may also foster better rapport. And if nothing else, it's just a nicer way to interact with our clients. So now that you know what to do, you could follow Hedley Lamar from Blazing Sales Advice to now go do that hoodoo that you do so well. Wonderful picture of Andy. And again, performance. Now imagine you see this gentleman walking into the office as your root doctor. It immediately gets your attention, doesn't it? It's a magical world out there. I'm Paul Leslie. I hope you've enjoyed this. You can obviously see me on YouTube. Look me up on Facebook, LinkedIn. I hope you've enjoyed this time learning about low country root workers, and I hope you got something out of it. Thanks for listening. Have a great day.